the voice coach who told Freddie Mercury he'd never sing. A prestigious voice coach looked at young Freddie Mercury and said, "You'll never be a professional singer." Those words almost killed his dream before it began, nearly silencing the voice that would become the most iconic in rock history. This is the untold story of devastating rejection, the critics who couldn't recognize genius, and how Freddie Mercury proved that sometimes the harshest judgment comes from people who understand the least. Ealing Art College, London. 23-year-old Farrokh Bulsara was on the verge of giving up his dream of becoming a professional musician. He'd been singing in small bands for years, but doubts were creeping in. Was he good enough? Could his unusual voice really connect with audiences? These questions led him to make a decision that would nearly end his musical career before it truly began. He sought the opinion of a professional voice coach. What happened in that studio over the course of 3 devastating lessons would haunt Freddie Mercury for the rest of his life. The expert's assessment was brutal, comprehensive, and completely wrong. But young Farrokh didn't know that yet. All he knew was that someone with credentials and experience was telling him his dream was impossible. This is the story of how close we came to never hearing Freddie Mercury sing, and how one person's limited vision almost robbed the world of its greatest vocalist. The search for validation. By 1969, Farrokh Bulsara had been pursuing music seriously for several years. He'd performed with various bands including Ibex and Sour Milk Sea, written original songs, and developed a distinctive performance style. But success remained elusive, and self-doubt was a constant companion. His voice was unusual, a powerful 4-octave range that didn't fit neatly into any conventional category. It wasn't the bluesy growl that dominated rock music, nor was it the smooth crooning of pop vocalists. It was something entirely unique, and Farrokh wasn't sure if that uniqueness was an asset or a liability. Friends remember him obsessing over his vocal technique during this period. He'd listen to recordings of himself and critique every imperfection. He'd compare his voice to successful singers and find himself lacking. The insecurity was particularly focused on his teeth, the prominent overbite that he believed affected his sound and definitely affected his confidence. He was terrified that his voice wasn't good enough, recalled a friend from art college. He had all this ambition and talent, but he couldn't see it himself. He kept saying he needed professional validation before he could really commit to music as a career. But what that professional would tell him nearly destroyed what little confidence young Farrokh had managed to build. And you won't believe how devastating the assessment actually was. The voice coach. The voice coach Farrokh sought out was a respected figure in London's music education scene. We'll call him Mr. Harrison, as his real name has been kept private by those who knew him. Harrison had trained at prestigious conservatories, worked with opera singers and musical theater performers, and taught at a well-regarded music academy. His credentials were impeccable, his reputation solid. He seemed like exactly the expert opinion Farrokh needed. The first lesson was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at Harrison's private studio in West London. Farrokh arrived early, nervous but hopeful. He'd prepared several songs to demonstrate his range, everything from rock numbers to more classical pieces, wanting to show the full scope of what his voice could do. Harrison was professional but cold from the start. He had Farrokh run through vocal exercises, scales, breathing techniques, resonance tests. With each exercise, his expression grew more skeptical. When Farrokh finally performed his prepared songs, Harrison's face was unreadable, which somehow felt worse than overt disapproval. After the performance, Harrison delivered his assessment with the kind of clinical detachment usually reserved for failed medical diagnoses. His words would echo through Farrokh's mind for years to come. The devastating verdict. "Your vocal placement is all wrong," Harrison began, launching into a technical critique that grew increasingly harsh. "You're singing from your throat rather than your diaphragm. Your tone is inconsistent. Your range, while broad, lacks the control necessary for professional work. And frankly, your vibrato is bizarre. It sounds almost like you're shaking the notes rather than sustaining them properly." But the assessment got worse. Harrison criticized Farrokh's performance style as theatrical to the point of distraction. He said the way Farrokh moved while singing would be laughed off any serious stage. He described the voice itself as peculiar and unmarketable, neither pop enough for commercial success nor trained enough for classical work. Then came the words that nearly ended everything. "Mr. Bulsara, I need to be honest with you. You'll never be a professional singer. Your voice is too unusual, your technique too unorthodox, and your performance style too eccentric. You might find work doing backing vocals if you're willing to completely retrain your approach, but as a lead vocalist, that's not going to happen." Harrison recommended that Farrokh pursue graphic design, his actual course of study at Ealing, and treat music as a hobby rather than a career aspiration. "Not everyone is meant to be a performer," Harrison said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. "It's better to recognize your limitations now than waste years pursuing an impossible dream." The aftermath. Farrokh left that first lesson in a state of shock. Friends who saw him later that day described him as devastated and almost catatonic. He'd gone seeking professional guidance and received instead a comprehensive rejection of everything he'd been working toward. Brian May, who had recently started collaborating with Farrokh, remembered receiving a phone call that evening. He was almost in tears, May recalled years later. He kept saying, "Maybe I'm fooling myself. Maybe I'm not good enough." It was heartbreaking because I'd already seen what his voice could do. But this teacher had shaken his confidence to the core. What made the rejection particularly cruel was Harrison's credentials. This wasn't just some random person offering an opinion. This was an expert, someone with years of training and experience. If someone like that said Farrokh would never make it, who was Farrokh to disagree? For the next several days, Farrokh seriously considered abandoning music entirely. He stopped attending band rehearsals, stopped writing songs, stopped even listening to music. He threw himself into his graphic design coursework, trying to convince himself that Harrison was right. He should focus on a real career. But here's what nobody expected. The rejection actually planted seeds that would eventually make Freddie Mercury even more determined to prove everyone wrong. The second lesson. Despite his devastation, something compelled Farrokh to return for a second lesson with Harrison. Maybe it was a need for closure, or perhaps some part of him hoped the first assessment had been a mistake. Whatever the reason, he scheduled another session for the following week. The second lesson was even worse than the first. Harrison had apparently consulted with colleagues and returned with additional ammunition for his critique. He presented Farrokh with a detailed written assessment that read like a post-mortem of a failed career. The document criticized everything from Farrokh's breathing technique to his vowel shapes, from his pitch accuracy to his emotional expression. Harrison had even analyzed Farrokh's teeth structure and concluded that the overbite was a physical limitation that will always compromise your vocal quality. He suggested dental surgery if Farrokh insisted on continuing to sing, though he made clear he still didn't think it would help enough to matter. But the most damaging part of the second lesson was Harrison's assessment of Farrokh's original songs. He dismissed them as derivative and lacking commercial appeal. He said the melodies were too complex for popular music, and the lyrics were pretentious. He essentially told Farrokh that even if by some miracle his voice was acceptable, his songwriting certainly wasn't. This second lesson ended with Harrison offering one final piece of advice. "Mr. Bulsara, you're young enough to change direction completely. Don't let stubbornness ruin your life. Accept that some dreams aren't meant to be realized and find something you're actually suited for." The breaking point. That night, Farrokh reached his lowest point. He was staying in a shared flat in Kensington, and his flatmates later described finding him sitting in the dark, his guitar next to him untouched, staring at the written assessment Harrison had provided. "I think I need to quit music," he told his friend Chris Smith. "Maybe I've been delusional this whole time. Maybe everyone's been too nice to tell me the truth." The crisis deepened when Farrokh made the mistake of calling his father to discuss the situation. Bomi Bulsara, who had always been skeptical of his son's musical ambitions, seized on Harrison's assessment as validation of his concerns. "Even the professionals can see you're wasting your time," Bomi reportedly said. "Come home, get serious about a real career, stop this foolishness." For 72 hours, the world teetered on the edge of losing Freddie Mercury before he ever existed. Young Farrokh Bulsara was within days of abandoning music entirely, accepting the expert's judgment that he wasn't good enough, and consigning his 4-octave range to silence forever. But something happened that changed everything, and what occurred next would prove that sometimes the harshest rejection can become the most powerful motivation. The turning point. The catalyst for change came from an unexpected source. Roger Taylor, the drummer Farrokh had been jamming with occasionally. Taylor had heard about Harrison's assessment and was furious about it. He showed up at Farrokh's flat uninvited and proceeded to deliver a reality check that would alter the course of music history. "That teacher is full of shit," Taylor said bluntly. "I've heard hundreds of singers. Your voice is extraordinary. Yes, it's unusual. That's what makes it special. This Harrison guy probably teaches wedding singers and cruise ship entertainers. What does he know about rock and roll?" But Taylor didn't stop at encouragement. He offered proof. He'd been recording some of Farrokh's performances and had played them for other musicians, producers, and music industry professionals. Their responses were unanimously positive. Several had asked who the singer was, with one producer describing the voice as the most interesting sound I've heard in years. Taylor produced cassette tapes and written comments from these industry professionals, real working musicians and producers, not academic teachers. Their assessments contradicted Harrison's critique in every respect. They praised the unusual vibrato that Harrison had criticized. They celebrated the theatrical performance style that Harrison had mocked. They recognized the commercial potential that Harrison had denied existed. "You can listen to some washed-up teacher who probably couldn't make it as a performer himself," Taylor concluded, "or you can listen to people who are actually succeeding in the music industry. Your choice." The transformation. That conversation marked the birth of Freddie Mercury's defiant spirit. The rejection that had nearly broken him instead became fuel for an almost superhuman determination to prove Harrison wrong. Farrokh made a conscious decision that day that would define the rest of his career. He would never again let anyone make him feel his voice wasn't good enough. Within weeks, Farrokh had legally changed his name to Freddie Mercury, a declaration that the insecure art student was dead and something new and powerful was taking his place. The Mercury was particularly significant, the messenger of the gods, impossible to pin down, defying categorization. It was a direct rebuke to Harrison's insistence that Freddie's voice needed to fit established categories. Brian May noticed the transformation immediately. It was like a switch had flipped. May remembered. Freddie went from questioning everything about his voice to having absolute confidence in it. He became almost aggressive about defending his style. If someone suggested he change his approach, he'd shut them down immediately. But the most significant change was internal. Freddie developed an almost obsessive drive to perfect his craft on his own terms, not according to conventional wisdom. He studied other unconventional vocalists, people who'd succeeded by being unique rather than by following rules. He practiced constantly, but he practiced to enhance his natural style rather than to conform to some teacher's idea of proper technique. The third lesson. Despite his new resolve, Freddie made one final visit to Harrison for a third scheduled lesson. But this time, he wasn't seeking approval. He was delivering a message. Friends who heard about this encounter describe it as Freddie's first truly confident performance. Freddie walked into Harrison's studio with complete self-assurance. When Harrison began to set up for another clinical assessment, Freddie stopped him. "I'm not here for your critique," Freddie said. "I'm here to tell you that you're wrong. My voice is extraordinary. My style is marketable, and I'm going to prove it." Harrison reportedly dismissed this declaration as youthful bravado, but Freddie wasn't finished. "I'm going to be successful doing exactly what you told me not to do. I'm going to sing the way I sing, move the way I move, and write the songs I want to write. And when I'm famous, I hope you remember this conversation and realize that your narrow definition of what makes a good vocalist almost silenced something special." Freddie then demanded a refund for all 3 lessons, arguing that Harrison had provided no useful instruction, only discouragement based on limited understanding. The confrontation became heated, with Harrison calling Freddie arrogant and delusional, but Freddie held his ground. He walked out of that studio for the last time with his head high, his voice unleashed, and his future wide open. The vindication. The story of Harrison's rejection became part of Queen lore, though Freddie rarely spoke about it publicly. When he did mention it, it was with a mixture of anger and satisfaction. Anger at how close he'd come to believing the lie, satisfaction at having proved it wrong so spectacularly. By 1975, just 6 years after Harrison had declared Freddie would never be a professional singer, Bohemian Rhapsody had topped charts worldwide. The unusual vibrato Harrison had mocked was recognized as one of rock's most distinctive vocal signatures. The theatrical performance style Harrison had dismissed was hailed as revolutionary. The voice that was supposedly unmarketable was selling millions of records. Roger Taylor later tracked down some of Harrison's comments about Queen's success. When asked about having taught Freddie Mercury, Harrison reportedly claimed he'd always seen potential in the young singer and had helped guide his early development. Taylor's response was unprintable but satisfying. More significantly, Harrison's critique was used by music schools as an example of how conventional training can blind educators to unconventional genius. The case study asked, how could a professionally trained voice coach be so completely wrong about one of history's greatest vocalists? The answer revealed uncomfortable truths about how rigid adherence to traditional technique can prevent recognition of revolutionary talent. The lasting impact. Harrison's rejection left permanent marks on Freddie's psychology. Even at the height of Queen's success, Freddie remained hypersensitive to vocal criticism. During recording sessions, he'd obsessively replay takes, convinced something was wrong with his delivery. The confidence he projected on stage masked ongoing insecurity about whether his voice was truly good enough. Brian May noticed this dynamic persisting for years. Even after we'd sold millions of records, after we'd played to hundreds of thousands of people, Freddie would still second-guess his vocals, May observed. That teacher had planted a seed of doubt that never fully went away, no matter how much evidence contradicted it. But the rejection also gave Freddie an almost superhuman work ethic regarding his voice. He practiced constantly, pushed his range relentlessly, and never took his vocal abilities for granted. The fear that Harrison might somehow be right, that success was a fluke that could disappear if he wasn't vigilant, drove him to constantly improve and experiment. Perhaps most significantly, Harrison's rejection made Freddie a champion for unconventional artists. Throughout his career, he encouraged other musicians who didn't fit traditional molds, who'd been told they weren't good enough, who'd faced rejection from supposed experts. He understood their pain intimately and used his success as proof that gatekeepers don't always know what they're guarding against. The Teacher's Reckoning. In 1985, after Queen's legendary Live Aid performance that many consider the greatest live rock performance ever captured, a journalist tracked down Harrison for comment. The teacher, now retired, was asked about his famous former student. According to the interview, Harrison initially tried to claim he'd never actually told Freddie he couldn't succeed, just that he needed more training. When confronted with written documentation of his assessments, he fell back on technical justifications, claiming Freddie's success came despite vocal flaws, not because of vocal strengths. But most tellingly, Harrison reportedly said, "I taught proper vocal technique. Mercury succeeded by breaking every rule I tried to teach him. That's not the same as me being wrong. It's him succeeding through unconventional means." The statement perfectly captured Harrison's failure to understand that breaking rules isn't the same as lacking talent. Sometimes it's the definition of genius. Friends say Freddie learned about this interview and laughed. "He'll go to his grave convinced he was right, and I was just lucky," Freddie reportedly said. Some people are so invested in their rules that they can't see when the rules themselves are wrong. The legacy. Today, Freddie Mercury's 4-octave range is studied in music schools worldwide as an example of extraordinary vocal ability. The unusual vibrato that Harrison criticized is now taught as a masterclass in controlled vocal technique. The theatrical performance style that was supposedly unmarketable became the gold standard for rock frontmen. Everything Harrison said was wrong proved to be exactly right. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the difference between technical knowledge and artistic vision. Harrison understood conventional vocal technique perfectly, but he had no ability to recognize how those conventions could be transcended by genuine talent. He could identify that Freddie was different. He just couldn't understand that different could be better. For artists facing rejection from supposed experts, Freddie's story offers both comfort and inspiration. Expertise doesn't equal omniscience. Technical knowledge doesn't guarantee artistic judgment. And sometimes the harshest criticism comes from people whose own limitations prevent them from recognizing something extraordinary. The final word. Freddie Mercury never forgot the voice coach who told him he'd never sing professionally. In interviews, he'd sometimes reference the teacher who almost convinced me to give up, using the story to encourage others facing similar rejection. But he'd also acknowledge a grudging gratitude for the experience. "That teacher taught me something valuable," Freddie said in a 1985 interview. though not what he intended. He taught me that I couldn't let anyone else define my limitations. He taught me to trust my own instincts even when experts said I was wrong. And he taught me that the most satisfying thing in the world is proving people wrong about you. The voice that Harrison said would never work professionally went on to sing some of rock's most enduring anthems. The techniques he criticized became the signature sound of a generation. The performer he dismissed as unmarketable became one of the most commercially successful artists in history. And the dream he tried to kill became a legacy that will outlive everyone involved in the story. Somewhere, in a parallel universe, Farrokh Bulsara listened to that voice coach and gave up singing. But in our timeline, he became Freddie Mercury instead, proving that sometimes the best response to being told you'll never make it is simply to make it anyway, exactly as yourself. That's the incredible story of how a voice coach's devastating rejection almost silenced Freddie Mercury, and how the harshest criticism became the fuel for rock's greatest vocalist. If this story inspired you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Mercury Moments family for more untold chapters from Queen's legendary frontman's life. Give this video a thumbs up if you've ever been told you weren't good enough and prove them wrong, and let us know in the comments about your own experiences overcoming rejection. Until next time, remember, the experts aren't always right, and sometimes being told you can't do something is the best motivation to do it anyway.